as bad as that is on the surface, and we might not want to just use it as is, I think it gives us a little bit of recognition that these are attempts, these are grasps for making some kind of meaning out of trauma. And even if we don't do exactly what they did, which we probably shouldn't do, all those moves, it teaches us kinds of things that we ought to do, or at least be aware of. And so I just want people to start thinking of, and again, it's not like I'm the only one doing this or this is new, but I'm just one of the ones who wants people to start finding ways that the Bible can be a dialogue partner and a resource, not one that has all the answers, but one that invites into and funds a conversation about the very kinds of things that you're bringing up there.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Brad Kelle. I didn't think it was pronounced that way either. I thought that E was just there for show. This is why I check before we start recording. I think at this point it would be 3 guests who have spoken about trauma, and now Brad Kelle being the 4th. Their work hasn't overlapped as much. Whereas for him in this article, he includes both Alexiana Fry and Sarah Emanuel. Rebecca Poe-Hayes is not included in this particular article. I'm just calling that out though, because this has been a pretty important topic for me to cover. And it's been, even just having these conversations has been pretty therapeutic. So I will not belabor this introduction. For those of you listening for free, please subscribe. Give me whatever likes or reviews or feedback that you can wherever you're listening, wherever you follow the podcast. Or don't follow the podcast yet, but please do. I would appreciate that. You can also reach out on any number of social media platforms: Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, Spoutable, Twitter, Threads, WordPress, Tumblr. I try to maximize the presence of the podcast across social media platforms. Or if you want to use the link in the show notes and go over to Patreon and become a supporter for $5 a month, you'll get episodes about 10 days early. And yeah, for right now, that's the best that I can offer. But you won't have to listen to me ask you to become a Patreon supporter anymore. So for $5 a month, you'd be helping out a lot. And I appreciate any engagement. Aside from that, if you want to give me feedback or guest suggestions or just find a new pen pal possibly, it means what it means at gmail.com. All one word. It means what it means at gmail.com. And now I will go ahead and throw to my conversation with Brad Kelle. Enjoy. Brad Kelle, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's awesome to be here.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am a professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego, California. So suffering out here in Southern California. And been here for 20 years now, since 2004. And I came out here from Emory University. That's where I did my PhD in Old Testament, was at Emory University there, and kind of finished in the early 2000s, and have been out here. And along with teaching, most of my work is around the prophets, prophetic texts in the Hebrew Bible, Israelite Judean history, and sort of trauma interpretation and related things to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I love it when you guys do like a little thoughtful setup to try to help me segue into what we're discussing. So we'll be discussing your Journal of Biblical Literature article, Is Hosea Also Among the Traumatized? The Book of Hosea and Trauma Hermeneutics. So jumping right in, and we discussed this. Shout out to Alexiana Fry. Shout out to Sarah Emanuel.
Yeah.
And then while she's not cited in the article, the other trauma conversation I've had on the podcast is Rebecca Poe Hayes. So I feel like you are in good company. Why? Kind of the premise of your article is prophetic texts have not really been given that much attention with regard to trauma in biblical studies. Do you mind beginning at that point?
Yeah, let me actually I'll back up one quick second and say, yeah, shout out, love those folks you just named. And shout out to a bunch of people. And so if somebody's listening and you don't know what the conversation has been around sort of trauma hermeneutics and the Bible, or particularly in my case, the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, the first part of the article does kind of survey a lot of what's going on. And there are so many people who've done so much good work. So, yeah, I'm standing on the shoulders of a bunch of people, and trauma. I think trauma engagement with biblical text is going in a lot of exciting directions. So there's a lot of stuff out there to take a look at. I might also just mention I came to this. I've done some work on trauma and prophetic texts elsewhere. I have a commentary on Ezekiel that uses sort of trauma hermeneutics. I'm certainly not the only one who's done that. And this article is a little spinoff of I'm currently writing the new Old Testament library series commentary on Hosea, which will be out 1,000 years from now. I don't know. Don't ask. But this is trying to also move in a trauma direction around Hosea. One more plug, not related to me. If folks are interested in this topic, perhaps they know the name Goran Adeval, who's a significant Old Testament prophet scholar in Europe. And he has written the new Anchor Bible commentary on Hosea, which is not out yet. I read the manuscript because I got to endorse it, and it's fantastic. But it also is sort of using a kind of trauma approach in some ways to Hosea. So there's a lot of ways in which trauma and the prophets are having their day at the moment, and I'm excited to be a part of that. So yeah, to your question, this is one of the things I try to talk about a little bit in the article, is why Hosea in particular has not, up until recently, been a major part of the conversation around interpreters' attempts to engage biblical texts with the lens of trauma. I think really that has less to do with Hosea itself and more to do with the general approach that trauma hermeneutics to the Bible took kind of early on. And that is to say that most of the attention, prophets wise, was given to prophetic texts or books or characters who had a real specific or explicit connection to the kind of destruction and exile in the 6th century. And so things like Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And we don't have that in Hosea, at least not in any kind of explicit way. And so in Hosea, you don't get a lot of sort of literary markers of missed traumatic experiences or details of the prophet's suffering in really explicit ways related to that, or reacting like you see in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, things like that. So I think a lot of it was more early on. The focus was on sort of explicit connections to the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile, and all of that. And slowly over time, it's kind of expanded out from there. And that's why we're now seeing, I think, some really interesting forays into other prophetic books and other books as well using trauma engagement.
I know I have trouble keeping this idea, or rather understanding how trauma is used as a biblical hermeneutic without kind of always gravitating toward trauma in like a therapeutic sense. And I'm sorry if you can hear my dogs; they're feeling a little frisky. I
I
may have
love
to
it.
get them a treat. But so trauma as a hermeneutic or a heuristic, does it differ at all from trauma in a therapeutic sense?
Yeah, it's a good question to ask for this reason. It has moved around. Early on, what was done with biblical texts and trauma hermeneutics did have a lot of similarity to therapeutic settings, which would be sort of a much more psychological approach to trauma that's focused on the experience of trauma, the recovery from that experience, usually individualized kind of a thing. So early on, and again, this was kind of par for the course in prophets study generally early on, there was a lot of focus on the individual prophetic character, almost in a sort of biographical kind of way of reconstructing their psyche or psychological experience or whatever. So early on, it did have that. But I think, we can see sort of the problems and issues that attend to that. Again, trying to sort of create these biographies of characters who, may or may not have been real human beings or whatever. It's hard to sort that out sometimes. Certainly hard to sort it out from the text that we have. And so where we've seen a shift, and I think it's really helpful, is a little bit, not that today's trauma hermeneutics aren't informed by what's going on in therapeutic and psychological approaches, but a little bit more of a shift. Where nowadays in trauma hermeneutics of the Bible, you get a lot more focus on communal trauma, or goes by various names, but we'll just call it communal trauma. That is how communities, societies, groups are impacted by trauma. And especially, I think, the literary dimensions of traumatic experience representation and healing, if you will. So there's a lot more emphasis now on, say, for example, thinking about the prophetic books that we have as something like not sort of the memoirs of a traumatized individual, but rather a kind of trauma infused composition, often created in the aftermath of trauma, to try to bear witness to that trauma, to try to make meaning out of that trauma, and oftentimes to do that through literary dimensions. So metaphors and images become key in sort of trauma hermeneutics, especially the prophets, as being laden down with sort of the resonances of trauma, the attempts to make meaning out of trauma. So I think we see biblical hermeneutics more moving in that way of communal and literary focus than any more trying to do, psychologize individual characters or something like that. Although that possibility is still there as we take these as literary characters as part of those trauma compositions.
It almost seems like there might even be layers where, on one level, if you're doing some kind of a Bible study and you want to understand, we'll say Hosea, there is the character, the man, the prophet Hosea, and so evaluating for any number of subjects, evaluating the main character,
Hmm.
there, evaluating the community around them, and then even maybe like a well, so literary, that could be how communities received it, and then like a
Exactly.
liturgical layer as well. So on one level there's like an attempt to chronicle or report what has happened, and that may mean reporting the trauma. And on another level, in doing the same thing, you're maybe, I don't know, communicating that this has happened, and you future generations can identify with it, or you can
Hmm.
avoid. Like, how do you see it? I'm more just kind of reaching for
Yeah.
how many tentacles does this thing have? Sorry.
That's right. No, you're exactly right. And if there's anything about trauma that we know, it's multi-layered and multi-dimensional at all times, and that includes the literary expressions of trauma as well. When you're talking about, for example, the prophetic books. So yeah, I think the notion of transgenerational trauma, which is something that I talk about a little bit in the article, and something that a few scholars have begun to use in particular with the prophetic books, is getting after exactly what you're saying, that there are layers. There's sort of an originating trauma that might or might not be reflected in, say, a biblical book that you're looking at. But then there's also that question of how that trauma becomes transgenerational, if not transhistorical in some ways, where it is getting not only expressed and remembered for new generations, but also perhaps imprinted upon them in some ways. And then they are invited to sort of wrestle with it. So I think we see a little bit of all of that going on. And the notions of communal trauma and transgenerational trauma, are things that I think point us in the direction of appreciating the kinds of things you're saying, whether it's what we're doing with a text or what's actually perhaps going on within the text itself when we read it.
I don't normally just like keep referring to my questions, but while you were talking and kind of the area that we landed in, I'm wondering about the final forms. So,
Mhm. Yep.
final forms of the prophetic texts. That's an interesting concept because, again, with layers, so not just layers of trauma, but could we be seeing a layer added to something or maybe edited in an older version or from an older version that communicates maybe trauma that wasn't necessarily intended to be there as this thing initially started to circulate? Does that make
Mm.
sense?
Yeah. Yeah. This is where I think trauma, and I like the way you phrased the question or the statement. This is where I think trauma has something interesting to offer that could potentially breathe some new life into an aspect of the study of the prophets that has been around forever, but I don't know, gotten a little staid and boring. And that's sort of this question of the redactional or compositional history of these books. Everybody knows that there's evidence that texts were modified over time, or that there may be different redactional elements or layers, whether those were piecemeal or kind of an overall redactional program or something. And scholars will differ on their opinion of how much or how little there's redactional activity in a book like Hosea. I don't think there's that much. Others might think there are, but everybody knows that there are elements in which these texts were modified over time. And of course, if you've followed biblical studies much in terms of prophetic study, this has been a long-standing and still today area where people are proposing various redactional schemes or layers or all kinds of things to it. So this is one of the places I think trauma has something interesting to offer, which is to say something like, if we're thinking about communal trauma and if we're thinking about transgenerational trauma, and then we're looking at these compositions that we have, um, is it possible for us to try to take more seriously the way that what might be sort of scribal additions or redactional layers or whatever we want to call them, is there a way to view those things not simply as regular old redactional updates or whatever, but as connected to the experience of trauma in some way, whether that is doing something with an originating trauma that they're then kind of working on later, or introducing sort of some traumatic experience, something into what seemed to be a kind of a stable originating message or something like that. So, in other words, is there a way that trauma hermeneutics can kind of reframe the way we think about redactional layers, redactional additions, and so on? So, I'm hopeful. I talk about this just a little bit at the end of the article, as in, like, what might happen from here, because I'm in the article, I focus kind of on the originating trauma context where Hosea is sort of set rhetorically and literarily in the 8th century and the Neo-Assyrian Empire and all that. But I'm kind of hopeful that future interpreters will think about, kind of exploiting the creative tension between thinking about Hosea as a prophetic book that's oriented to its originating context, but also as a kind of trans historical composition that could be addressing multiple audiences and contexts through rereading, reworking, etc. And so, do we see, maybe, I guess what I would say is maybe in the future, scholars who focus particularly on proposing, redactional moves or editorial layers or whatever, or see Hosea as sort of a complex, multi generational scribal work, maybe they could think about those layers or those redactional elements as efforts to either preserve the memory of some originating trauma and kind of imprint it on later generations so that they deal with it or for particular reasons or whatever, or to sort of introduce multiple engagements with that trauma that might be related to what's going on in the book. So I think there's something there. I don't know exactly what it is. I don't do it, but I think other people might. And I think your way of putting it is great. Like, does trauma engagement offer some new ways to think about a really old claim about the prophetic books that you can see evidence of sort of modification over time, or whatever, at least at a large scale, if not at smaller scale as well.
I don't think this occurred to me until just now, but I, I think maybe my understanding of prophetic texts from growing up going to church was like, well, they're there to communicate some kind of a condemnation, or I'll be honest, most of the time when people use the word prophecy, they meant it in a predictive or foretelling kind of sense.
Right.
Does does thinking about how an individual or a community experiences trauma, and that they can read a prophetic text and maybe come to understand their trauma a little bit better, does that change that connotation around the word prophetic in your mind?
It can. I mean, I grew up like you, it sounds like, in a sort of, more conservative evangelical sort of setting. And that is the way that the prophets were mostly introduced, was these are the predictors of Jesus, or these are the crystal ball gazers, sort of predict stuff thousands of years off in the future. So I don't think trauma is the only way to give some corrective there. But I do think it's one of the ways that focuses a little bit away from, well, first of all, focuses maybe a little bit away from the individual prophet themselves to the book or the composition as a whole, but I think ties it into larger questions rather than just trying to predict something or some person or whatever. A book like Hosea, for example, I think is tied into the question of what does the experience of trauma do to a community, particularly a community that identifies itself as, the people of God, or Yahweh's people, or whatever. What does the experience of trauma do to their self understanding, their identity, and the practices that sort of form that identity? And that's what I think is usually going on in these prophetic books when you look at it through the lens of trauma. Is they are wrestling, sometimes I think in Hosea's case, opposing other sort of reactions and responses to trauma that's going on, but wrestling with the question of, in light of what is happening to us, who are we? Um, and how are we supposed to be in the world? In light of who we think God is and who we think we are and what is happening around us. So it becomes, I think, a much broader and richer and more meaningful, in my view, engagement with the prophets than just seeing them as sort of these crystal ball gazers who are largely detached from the experiences of their time and their place, and just talking about stuff thousands of years off in the future, but really see them as part of the struggle to understand what it means to be the people of God and your identity and your practices in the middle of traumatic experiences that are coming either from the outside or from within. And sometimes you can't tell the difference in the prophets as far as some of their condemnations go. So I don't know if that gets at what you're saying, but I think that's another gift that trauma can give to the ongoing work on the prophets.
Yeah, no, that is helpful. Listeners have heard me talk about this in the three others, mentioning Hurricane Harvey. So if you talk about the trauma that happened to a community from something like a natural disaster,
Mm-hmm.
it is a little bit more explicit. It's a little bit more conscious, I think, than the biblical texts, the way they deal with things, whether they're psalms or prophetic texts. There is a little bit more literary, creative aspect, and not quite so direct at the thing. Is there something that you could point to that would be analogous for us for that kind of a prophetic voice when something uh, traumatic happens? And it's fine if you can't. I understand that's not what your
Yeah.
article's about, but I'm just realizing a lot of the preconceived notions around what prophets, prophecy, prophetic texts are maybe get read back into those things. And if we can find some kind of a touchstone that we might understand how a prophet functioned in
Mm.
that world.
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. I mean, you asked several questions all at once in that question there. So, but uh, if you're asking, let me ask you this: are you asking like, are there places where the prophets are addressing things that are more like sort of natural disasters or whatever, as opposed to, or are you asking for, different ways of understanding what the prophets were besides predictors of the future kind of thing?
I think culturally we communicate in a much more overt way,
Okay.
and so we don't necessarily always have at our disposal something that could help us understand what a biblical text is
Mm,
doing. And
mm,
an example that I've liked to use in the past is the Bob Dylan song "A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall."
mm.
When talking about apocalyptic literature, I would be like, okay, did he actually see a white man who walked a black dog, or is he
Right,
saying
right,
something else here?
right.
So, and understanding we're not talking about apocalyptic, but in a more artful,
Mm,
maybe
yeah.
obscure way for us, because we see a biblical text as it is theological, it is liturgical, it is what, however we've experienced it. I guess I'm hoping for, is there
Mm.
something analogous to a prophetic biblical text that we could
Oh, I see.
use?
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's going to be that different from the things we talk about with other things, like you mentioned, apocalyptic. I mean, music, art, all of these things, I think, are proven ways of engaging trauma, and also have become useful in prophetic, not prophetic only, but biblical text interpretation as well, by putting things in dialogue with, whether it's various kinds of art, various kinds of music, various kinds of literature. So I think there's a lot of, I think there are a lot of possibilities there. And one thing that might be interesting to folks who are, if you're specifically interested in trauma and biblical studies, a number of different books put biblical text into dialogue with different things that are outside the Bible as a means of fostering that engagement with trauma in the readers. So, just, off the top of my head, I can think of, for example, Juliana Clausen's has a recent book where she reads sort of Hebrew Bible narratives in dialogue with modern trauma novels. If you're not familiar with modern trauma novels, you can check that out. You can find them all. But she's basically using that as an example. Uh, Todd Linnefeld has a book on Lamentations, where he reads Lamentations in dialogue with modern survivor literature of folks who have survived various kinds of traumatic experiences. So I think that's one of the kind of, it's one of the linchpins, really, of prophetic engagement with biblical text, is to think about whether it's art, whether it's music, whether it's comparative. What do we bring in that, oh, here's what expressions of trauma might look like? And so, does that either alert us to expressions that might be in the biblical text that we might be just overlooking, especially the use of metaphors and images and symbols and things like that? Or does it allow us to see things in there that maybe we think, oh, this could in fact be related to trauma, or invite us into that conversation in that way? So yeah, comparison is at the heart, I think, of trauma engagement with biblical text.
So I think on that note, I think I've mentioned it a few times. I've been reading this series of books, kind of in the fantasy space, by an author named Naomi Novik, and
Okay.
in explaining the magic, everybody just kind of has um, like a talent or a predilection for certain types of magic. And the main
Hmm.
character, she's kind of naturally moving toward darker kinds of magic, but she's resisting that. But the school that she goes to, when you make a request like, "Oh, the soul is coming off my shoe, I need a spell to bind it back on," it gives her a spell that's like binding people's bodies together or something, and she has to
Wow.
keep working through that. And so just like initial introduction, I'm like, oh, this really seems like the algorithm. And I'll say, as a content creator now, I'm a
Yeah,
little bit more aware of the algorithm than I
right.
was. Like,
Yeah.
oh,
Algorithm with a capital A, algorithm.
I got hundreds of views on this video, but not that video. And then I
Right.
look like, oh, I did a much better job of putting hashtags in one than the other.
Right.
But then it goes on, and this environment that these kids live in is very, very violent, and they are on their own. And Fortunately, one of the children in my house is now no longer in school. But I remember a time right after an active shooter event, not in his school, but somewhere in the country, which
Mm,
over the 12 years he was in school could have been any number of events. And he wanted to wear sandals to school. And I just like snapped at him that no, you can't do that. And he didn't understand because he was too young.
right.
All
Right.
of that is to say, like, I was confronted with that memory here with, after my 18-year-old son just finished high school, and I don't have to worry about sending one of the children to school in an environment, but that we are living in this, and the data, the news stories that I hear, and this is kind of we're hearing explicit facts, overt facts, it's conscious. It hits and it's sad, but that is data that I can then move on from. But then being enveloped in this story about this girl and a group of people she develops into to becomes friends with, it starts to hit me emotionally, and I
Mm,
have to go back and re-deal with that thing that I dealt with. And I hope that's not too much of a departure, but I do feel like that's in
yeah.
line with what you're saying.
Yep.
um what other kinds of are there other examples of the trauma novels, survivor things? And also shout out to Todd Linnefelt, former guest.
Oh
I,
yeah.
I may need to look into that book
Yeah.
too, because lament is very
I was
important.
at Emory. Todd's an Emory guy, so I've been knowing Todd for a long time, and
He's so cool.
he's awesome.
um Sorry, I interrupted my question
It's
with,
okay.
with the shout
Right.
out, but yeah,
Shout out.
on the topic of not necessarily fiction but art,
Mm,
are there things that you think like, yeah, go look at this? This is a very poignant
mm.
example of what I'm talking about.
That's a good question. I haven't thought enough about that to probably answer off the top of my head. For me, I can tell you what often does it is when I look at movies, I just tend to see, are we processing trauma here in this movie or not in some ways, and how is it being processed? And I think movies do that for me, and music does it for me. I don't know that there's a prescription. I think that you almost in some ways you realize you got to go look for yourself and you got to go think. But I think it's about a lens. I know it sounds really too simple to say this, but what trauma hermeneutics essentially boils down to is thinking about trauma while you read biblical texts. And I think the same thing is true. If you think about trauma while you watch a movie, or think about trauma while you watch or listen to music, or what, those connections will emerge. And it's not, and all of a sudden you begin to realize the ways that trauma is being maybe expressed or named in indirect ways, right? That it's not, doing the overt thing, but also the way that it's being attempted to be uh, processed and what it's suggesting out of it. So I don't have any specific thing to go look at, but I would encourage folks to just say, think about trauma while you watch or while you listen and see what happens. And we mentioned our friend Alexiana Fry. I think this is one of the strengths of her book, is that she pushes us in that book. She pushes the readers toward thinking about what happens to you as you read this story. What emotions do you feel? What impact does it have? What do you experience as you read it? Not just what's going on in the text, but what do you like, even physically? Like, what do you like? What's happening to you? Like, just pay attention to that. And I think that's the first step toward really, then, Jared, almost anything can be a useful comparison or a useful engagement if you're willing to sort of think about trauma while you watch or while you listen or while you read in some way.
So when I muted my mic and I was readjusting, I noticed I forgot he's back there. My supervisor for the podcast, that's Tiny Kurt Vonnegut. That's a little knit Kurt Vonnegut doll.
Nice.
And I read Slaughterhouse-Five
Hmm.
at the very beginning of the War on Terror,
Hmm.
and by the time he died, um, which I found out the day after, but
Hmm.
I remember finding how I found out the day. So my son had been sick. My son was, not even 2 months, not even 2 months old yet. And it was the day after my birthday, and we had just taken him to the doctor, and I was so tired. And I was watching the News Hour with Jim Lehrer, and they did this story on Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who had suffered traumatic brain injury,
Mm.
who were now being cared for by their parents. So I'm primed for sad
Mhm.
stuff to come my
Mhm.
way, and looking at my baby and like, oh man, that's. And then, they're like, and now an in memoriam for American novelist Kurt Vonnegut. And by that point, I had read all of Kurt Vonnegut's novels.
Wow.
He's my favorite author. But
Wow.
Slaughterhouse Five, specifically being, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time, and this is
Mm.
talking about processing trauma. This
Mm.
is Kurt Vonnegut processing his experience
That's good.
at a POW camp in Dresden during the firebombing. And
Mm.
like either of those elements could be and
Right.
was traumatic.
Right.
And I think that stark experience with him really made his art and what he was communicating more poignant. And I understand it had to come home to me to now it's linked to this sad thing, but like
Yeah.
I don't think I had had the opportunity when I was 19 and I read Slaughterhouse Five, and I
Mm.
had not seen my generation go through the
Right.
horrors that they would go to, which now I think unjustly have been largely overlooked and forgotten.
Hmm.
Whether we're talking about first responders from 9
Yep.
11 kind of being abandoned,
Yeah.
or Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, where I feel like rhetorically in the country right now, we're heading back in a bellicose direction when it seemed like we had learned our direction.
Hmm.
All of that. Sorry, I know I'm rambling.
Okay.
We're here to talk about your
Oh,
article, but
it's
but
good.
addressing the immediate sadness of, oh, my favorite author died,
Hmm.
and the larger, I had the good fortune of living in a world with a
Hmm.
man who was doing his processing in front
Hmm.
of us. He had that courage and that vulnerability, and my son will not have that. I know he does. There are others, but we have
Right.
now lost this force for beauty and
Yeah.
truth. And because I'm starting to cry, I'm going to mute my mic and let you respond to that.
Hey, it's perfectly understandable, man. And I think that's the beauty of literature, that it's true. Yes, it's true. Your son will not have him, but it is possible for him to have those texts that live on beyond him. And I think that's one of the gifts that biblical literature can give, with all of its problematics, and there's certainly problematic elements there. But we have these compositions that have survived and that have come down and can continue to be engaged. And that I think moves them into a new level of relevance, where you begin to read these things not just as, okay, well, this is something that happened back then, or this is something that's predicting the future, or but here's the legacy in writing of a community, or perhaps multiple communities over time, uh, in not only feeling the effects, but attempting to engage and work through, give expression to, make meaning out of trauma, and then to say, you know what, sometimes they seem to do that really well, and other times maybe not. Like, maybe there's things here we learn the opposite lesson from what's going on in some of these prophetic books. Certainly, there's a lot of blaming the victim and a lot of violent stuff that shows up in these texts. And so, trauma helps us, I think about those things. But to your point, I mean, this to me is the beauty of art, and art includes literature, it includes music, it includes movies. That the next generation and the next generation and the next generation, actually they can have those voices in their lives, and they can engage those things, because those will outlive the individuals. And I think that's a helpful thing that trauma hermeneutics gives to biblical texts, is think of these as compositions that are even somewhat transhistorical, and not necessarily tied to the life of one particular big inspired person or something, which was the way we usually thought about the prophets, even just maybe 100 years ago or so. So love what you're saying, and I hope you let your kid read Slaughterhouse Five, man, and everything else, because
Let
yeah,
let
fair,
mm.
assigned. There's a syllabus, and
Yeah, no, that kid has, yeah, he's been exposed to Vonnegut for a long time.
Good stuff.
So with regard to specific instances, so kind of my memory of reading Hosea as a teenager and then in my 20s, I just have this memory of like basically he's a guy who's cuckolded and it's all for theater. What, which I, I mean, I'm not saying that is the fullness of it. I'm saying I think that may be for
Oh
sure
yeah,
for me and possibly collectively.
for sure.
Um, I guess rather than just saying, I don't know, I'll ask the question that's in my head. It feels inadequate, but I'll just ask it. Would you point people to a different, like, is there something different you would have them look for when they're reading
Yeah.
Hosea than that?
Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, the thing about Hosea, it's a little bit like Job, right? Most people know the beginning and the ending of Job and don't know anything that happens in between, which is where the real, the real stuff happens in that book. Hosea, the legacy of Hosea, and I mean, I've written a couple of articles that are sort of history of scholarship on Hosea, and the legacy of Hosea is most people know or think they know kind of the story at the beginning of Hosea's sort of troubled family life. But there's 14 chapters, and so we're like a long way. There's a lot more in this book than just that. So I think two things in answer to your question. One of the best things you can do with Hosea, I think, is read beyond chapter 3. Like read chapters 4 to 14 and watch because it's a whole new experience. It's not at all focused around this metaphor or this, the image of this marriage or this troubled family or whatever. So that's number one. Like read beyond and see what happens in the rest of the book, especially if you're reading it through this kind of lens we're talking about here. You're going to see some different things. And what you're particularly going to see is, I think, a real struggle, a real contest going on between Hosea's voice and the voices of sort of the cultural power brokers of the day, political, religious, all of it, over how to respond to this rising trauma of imperialism and militarism and all that's happening around them. That now, with the Assyrian Empire starting to bear down on Israel in a really significant way, especially by about the mid 8th century and on, you're going to see I mean, there's a real struggle. Admittedly, we're kind of only hearing Hosea's voice, but you don't have to read between the lines too much to see that he is very concerned that the kinds of responses, the ways that people are responding to the traumas they are encountering, are harming the community, not helping the community, and are tearing apart the fabric of the community, not holding it together. And so, I mean, how much more relevant can you want than to ask questions about how are we going to respond in traumatic times, and that there are ways of responding that are going to be helpful and ways that aren't. And so that's first thing. The second thing I would say is revisit the famous stuff, revisit Hosea's marriage and family and all that in chapters 1 to 3, revisit it through the lens of trauma. Think about it not as just okay, here's a biography of some guy or whatever. The text is way too complicated to permit some kind of simplistic biographical reading of that thing. But rather, what do we have here as a symbol of what is happening to the social body, the people of Israel? Who represents who? And are there multiple representations going on within those first 3 chapters? But thinking about it as I talk about in the article, one of the ways that you can do a trauma interpretation of that is to think of chapters 1 to 3 and the story of Hosea and Gomer and the family and the kids and all that as a means of what in trauma study is called personalizing trauma. In other words, it's a way of taking what's happening to a social body where things are sort of, not right or coming apart or whatever, and expressing it by personalizing it. into the life of someone. So this is a pretty common thing in sort of trauma state. So I would say go back to that and don't think of it and don't read it in biographical ways necessarily. Don't read it as Hosea just automatically sort of represents God and then, he's all hurting and, faithful and stuff. But rather, is this some sort of larger symbolic representation of the trauma of the social body? And I think there's a lot of different ways you can go with that. You probably know there's no shortage of literature that's been published about Hosea chapters 1 to 3. So there's a lot of different ways you can go with it, but I think that's a really interesting way to revisit some of that without just, like you said, falling into. Now, got to tell you, the movies that have been made about Hosea, not great. And there have been some. There have been some. In fact, I taught a class about a year ago or so where we did basically looked at movies that have been made supposedly off of the book of Hosea. Some of them are spectacularly bad. There's a lot of novels also. Francine Rivers ones come to mind. Those are, well, I don't know what your endorsements are. I shouldn't say things. Anyway, read them
I don't
critically.
have what do you hold on? I don't have any endorsements. If it's bad, say it's bad, man.
Redeeming
Or type
love.
it out in the text and I'll say it's bad. I don't care.
Redeeming Love is one of the more famous, and it was recently made into a major Hollywood movie by one of those kind of Christian film companies and whatever. It is sort of doing the opposite of what you want to do when you read Hosea 1 to 3, I think, which is it's doing this romanticizing sort of biographical, blah blah. It's set, of course, he's a Western and Hosea is a cowboy, which of course, how could he not be? But I would say, be careful with that stuff. But there are some, I can't. There's one I really liked. I can't remember the name. It was such an obscure little film, but it was really exploring the way that this is symbolizing the trauma that a community or a person might be going. So see what happens if you go back and reread it with trauma in mind. I think it might help with some of the things that often happen there.
I wonder if so while you were talking, I was thinking about like okay, so obviously there's a larger context where, the Assyrians are coming and there's war and there's destruction and all of the things that come along with that. And there is a message of and you're in the find out phase. And
Hmm.
that reminded me of like Jerry Falwell saying that Hurricane Katrina happened because there were gay people
Right.
in America, probably he was saying in New Orleans.
Right.
And so reducing a large scale thing to it's about this concept of personal sinfulness
Hmm.
and you're saying don't do that.
Right. Right.
Don't do that.
Right. I mean, the biblical texts are far too complicated and multi-layered and multi-perspectival for that. Are there places in biblical texts, even in prophetic texts, even in Hosea, where those kinds of moves are made? Sure. Like where there is a sense of, you have done this thing and you're the reason that this has happened, right? Sure. Those are there for sure. And sometimes those are probably correct, right? Like sometimes, yeah, we brought this on ourselves. But those are not the only voices that are there for sure. And that's one of the things that I think trauma has done is allowed us to see the different perspectives that are present within biblical texts about how to respond to trauma, even about who's responsible for it. Certainly, you can think of the book of Job is exploring this deeply. But trauma wise, interestingly, I really am a fan of a scholar named David Jansen. I don't know if you know that name, but he's done a lot of work on trauma and the Deuteronomistic history. So Joshua, Judges, First King, Samuel, First Kings. And one of the things his books try to do, a couple volumes now, is to look at the way that the Deuteronomist history is really trying to give a master narrative that explains what has happened in the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile as the fault of the sinfulness of the people. Like it's working really hard to do it. And it does it to a major extent. And yet, what he's trying to show in his books is that in the middle of that master narrative are all these gaps and silences and things that seem to to poke at that and undercut that in some ways and say that's far too simple of an explanation. And Job, for example, when you're thinking in these ways and you're thinking about the whole, for example, of the Christian canon or the Jewish canon, you've got Job coming alongside representing and saying, okay, well, you may be saying in the Jewish history that the destruction of the exile happened because of the sinfulness of the people, but surely you can't mean like every individual person is, you surely can't mean that every individual person is this deeply sinful thing. Like that doesn't work. So I think the point is that one of the gifts that trauma gives as a lens onto the scripture is it allows you to see a significant diversity that is there when it comes to efforts to explain trauma and certainly efforts to respond to them, suggesting that trauma is a much more complicated thing than just, oh, hurricane. Oh, that must be a judgment from God. Oh, we know it's those gays. Like that was literally the logic of the dude you were referring to there. And I remember watching it and thinking, like, I mean, come on, man. Like, what are we even doing here? 9/11, same thing. Like, so are we going to learn from the resources we have how to think better and respond better and process better trauma, or not? And all I think biblical studies folks like me and my colleagues are trying to do is say, hey, the biblical text could actually be an asset and a resource among others, like you've been talking about, among others, for doing that kind of thing, but you gotta engage them in some of these better ways. Otherwise, they can actually play the opposite role in the hands of, of some folks.
So someone recently said, a coworker, she's just finding out that I have the podcast, and she was saying, so my mom believes in God. And I'm like, okay, cool. And she's like, but she won't read the Bible because it's been, changed over time. Well, her mom's not there, so I can't interrogate that.
Right,
She
right.
could have meant a number of things, right? I will say my brain immediately goes to some of the, at the Council of Nicaea they decided on the conspiracy Dan Brown kind of thinking.
Right,
And I'm
right.
not attributing that to this woman, but that's immediately what my, just physically I'm primed to argue against. But so I think it's fair to acknowledge, like you said, so there's a Deuteronomistic tradition. So within a biblical text, just take Joshua, like within a biblical text, there may be multiple perspectives. And I think that's helpful to acknowledge that, like,
Yes.
when someone raises their hand, whether it's the Westboro Baptist Church or someone who's a little bit more publicly acceptable, like for whatever reason Jerry Falwell was. Actually, that's not fair. There's a very obvious reason he was more socially acceptable than they were.
Yeah.
But when they say this, it seems so reductive.
Hmm.
I am reminded of my conversation with Yi Jan Lin, where she says, look, Asian communities, Black communities, Hispanic communities, communities of all kinds have engaged biblical texts in the way that she did in a JBL article where she rewrites Hebrews 11 to 12:1, talking about the experience of AAPI people and engaging with a biblical text. So the whole
Hmm.
thing, the whole enterprise, as on a literary point of view, from a liturgical point of view, from a devotional point of view as an individual, is a negotiation. And
Hmm.
if you want to be involved in the negotiation, all you have to do is jump in and start. And that could be your church having a larger conversation.
Hmm.
So, and sorry, again, I know I tend to go off, but
It's
like
okay. It's
one
good.
of the things that I'm working through is that I did come from a reductive tradition that said, like, nope, this is it.
Yeah.
And I get that everybody is stating their point of view, but culturally, that point of view had become very dominant. And the
Hmm.
thing that I'm being able to work through is to acknowledge there is this perspective and there are other perspectives. And sometimes I don't know who's right. And sometimes, like, no one is so far off base that I'm going to reject any of it.
Right.
And that has been really helpful and healing for me
Hmm.
to get to the issue of personal trauma and
Hmm.
pain and isolation and all of those things. So
Yeah.
engaging with people, individuals one at a time, in having a conversation about their academic or their pastoral work here on the podcast has been very helpful. And I think you hit the nail on the head in a big picture kind of way of like, hey, what if that does seem like it's what you guys in biblical studies are doing. So thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. I mean, I just want, I'm a biblical scholar by training. I'm a Christian. I'm a minister. I don't pastor a church, but I mean, I'm ordained. And I think I just want people to realize the Bible can be a resource for struggling through or making their way through traumatic experiences. But it doesn't give up its fruits easily because, it didn't just fall from the sky the other day after God wrote it or something, right? I mean, it's coming out of, um, a really long process of deeply embedded human experiences that are trying to, you might say, depending on your, I guess, understanding of scripture or something, you might say with God's help and inspiration or whatever, but still human beings trying to work through and express these things as best they can. And I hope that some of what goes on, whether it's with the kind of um, ethnic focused or post colonial or trauma or whatever, is a way of saying these texts are alive. Like they can continue to come into communities and speak in different ways because that's where they came from and that's the nature of them. So it's not just about, let me find, the one explanation for trauma that's present and now I know what it is and then slap that on to every situation, but let me go to something that is going to not necessarily give me the answer, but cultivate in me the ability to think in multiple ways about trauma. And sometimes what biblical text can do the most is just give us words we don't have to express things that go with trauma. The Psalms are great for this, obviously. I mean, as this is part of their origin, is to give words that we don't have. When you need to say, F you, God, you totally screwed me over. And I'm pretty sure this is all your fault and I did nothing to deserve it. Pretty hard for us sometimes to come up with those words. But there they are in the Psalms. That might have been a looser translation, but there they are in the Psalms, right? Like saying, God, you've done this to me, Psalm 88 or whatever. So I hope that people, and this is especially useful for the prophets. I want to give big shout outs, and maybe even shout outs. I love your shout outs. Big shout out to Kathleen O'Connor and her work on Jeremiah early on. Was one of the first places that this stuff was kind of coming in, and her starting point in her book Jeremiah Pain and Promise is, she kept encountering students in a seminary setting who said, I can't read the book of Jeremiah, it's too violent, the portrayals of God are awful, even the prophet is, it's just I can't read it, like it just, and I can't do anything with it. Like, what am I supposed to do, preach from this, whatever. And that's what basically led her to a trauma interpretation of the book of Jeremiah, saying, what if you flip it around and start to read the stuff you're seeing in there, the metaphors and images of violence and talking about God, as these are expressions of traumatic experiences that actually Jeremiah and Jeremiah's community are having. And they talk about God being violent because that's what they've experienced. They've experienced violence. And this is a way, somehow, some way. And I'd say this about Hosea too. When you read Hosea saying God's doing this and God's doing that, it's easy for us to look at that and go, what kind of stupid, ancient, unsophisticated theology is that? Unless you're Jerry Falwell, who then loves that theology. But what we may not realize is, as bad as that is, and as much as we wouldn't want to take that and just run with it, it's an attempt to make sense out of trauma in desperation, because it wasn't God who did those things, that it was the Assyrian emperor. But if you say it's the Assyrian emperor who did it, the Assyrian emperor has all the power. I mean, this is an effort to say, you know what? Screw the Assyrian empire. This was our God who did this to us. And if it wasn't the emperor, but it was our God, therefore maybe there's some hope that things could be different. Like, we can persuade our God to be differently toward. So as bad as that is on the surface, and we might not want to just use it as is, I think it gives us a little bit of recognition that these are attempts, these are grasps for making some kind of meaning out of trauma. And even if we don't do exactly what they did, which we probably shouldn't do, all those moves, it teaches us kinds of things that we ought to do or at least be aware of. And so I just want people to start thinking of, and again, it's not like I'm the only one doing this or this is new, but I'm just one of the ones who wants people to start finding ways that the Bible can be a dialogue partner and a resource, not one that has all the answers, but one that invites into and funds a conversation about the very kinds of things that you're bringing up there.
Thank you for that. And yeah, always shout outs. You're making it really easy to write the show notes. And
Okay.
on the yeah, and on the subject of shout outs, so recommendations to read, listen to, watch, for things to understand prophetic literature, as it appears in biblical texts, or
Yeah.
trauma as a hermeneutic, or just anything else about Hebrew Bible that you wanted to throw in there. Where would you send listeners?
Yeah. Well, let me, before I mention book stuff, let me say, and I am so mad. I almost picked up my phone, tried to find it. I cannot. I see it on Twitter or on X, whatever we call it now. There, you can look it up. You might probably already know it. Somebody's probably mentioned it. There is a Center for Trauma Hermeneutics. I can't remember the name of it now. I'm so mad that I forgot to look it up, but you'll find it, I'm sure, and can hit it. But it's something like Trauma, Biblical Research, Religion, Theology Institute, things of that nature, which is puts out some really good stuff. I definitely, probably if you search something, you'll find it. But I definitely would suggest that for an online presence. And there are a number of other kinds of online things that a search would, I think, would pull up in various ways. Let me mention some book stuff that's related to Hebrew Bible stuff in particular. And actually, I think we've mentioned a number of people, but for those who might be interested in Old Testament stuff and trauma in particular, I would say there's a book by Elizabeth Boas and Christopher Frechette. It's an edited volume called Bible Through the Lens of Trauma. If people aren't familiar with that, it's a great entry into it. You got that one up on the shelf there? Is that
It's up there. It's hidden
yeah?
behind something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great entry into the conversation with some specific examples as well. So if you're new to it, that's a great place to go to get a sense of it. On a more programmatic note, I love David Carr's book, Holy Resilience: The Bible's Traumatic Origins. Is that up there as well?
That's also up there. Unread. I haven't read either of them
Unread.
yet, but
Okay,
yeah.
fair enough. Well, it is on a programmatic level an attempt to do kind of an overall reading of the Hebrew Bible through the lens of trauma. And David's he's just a good writer. But anyway, so it's almost like reads like a novel, as opposed to your standard boring stuff that we typically write. So definitely that. And then prophets in particular, there's been one kind of attempted overall introduction to the prophets, sort of through the lens of trauma, a co-authored book by Louis Stuhlman and Paul Kim called "You Are My People." So if people are particularly interested in prophet stuff, that's the one kind of overall intro to the prophets that's really dived into. So you're seeing it more and more everywhere. So books wise and Hebrew Bible wise, those are definitely ones that I would mention for sure.
Okay.
Along with the many people we have shouted out throughout the
Yeah.
course of this
That
podcast.
yeah, they'll all get their links. What do you read for fun?
Oh man, Hosea. That's what I read for fun. Come on, man.
Yeah.
You know what? I like science fiction a lot, and I like the ongoing Star Wars stuff. Anything new that's expanding the Star Wars universe, I'm into it. So I like that stuff. But I like some historical fiction stuff, and particularly there's been a couple of biblical scholars who've recently sort of put out more kind of trade booky type stuff. There's a new one on Assyria by who's that by Eckhart? Who wrote that? Anyway, it's brand new out, and so I like stuff like that. But science fiction, I really like science fiction a lot, and I love Star Wars. I guess just being a child of the late '70s and '80s just did it for me.
I get that other people can be dissatisfied with it, and that's fine. But I don't really have any complaints. I haven't watched all of the new stuff that's come out, but I think I've
Ah,
seen all of the movies,
yeah.
and I don't get it.
Well, Andor, Andor, that series is fantastic. Some of the other series, yeah, I could give or take those, but Andor. Now I'm going to say something at the risk of great public, whatever. Okay, but here it goes. I am a huge professional wrestling junkie.
Go
So,
on.
professional wrestling is like I spend a lot of hours watching, reading about, attending conferences, doing all kinds of things. And there's something going on in professional wrestling as a kind of social drama and stuff that's really interesting. But yeah, so anytime you want to talk about professional wrestling, I'm always down for that. You being in Texas, I feel like should you know
Look, I am forever fascinated by the idea that, and it never really happened. I mean, maybe at some point for a little while it did with Stone Cold, but to
uh-huh.
watch like a beloved character like The Rock do a heel turn,
Yep.
and in real time you see a crowd of thousands of people go from chanting that he's the people's champ
Yep.
to hating him as the corporate champ.
Die,
I
Rocky,
cannot,
die.
right? I can't escape how that is. I mean, it's captivating, so of course I
Hey,
can't escape
so
it.
half your audience is tuned out by now, but if they're still
Good,
here,
good. They're
it,
not welcome.
they're not ready. If you're not aware of what's happening right now, perhaps the greatest face means good guy to the audience out there of all time, John Cena, recently turned heel for his final run and is executing his final run as this heelish character. And which is dramatic in lots of ways because he was sort of the unthinkable good guy. You couldn't imagine him doing anything. He's doing all the Make a Wish Foundation, grant wishes, and all the stuff. And so this is exactly what's happening. And I have to tell you, I was there about a month ago in Las Vegas at the Raiders Stadium for WrestleMania. Just me and about 80,000 of my closest friends, and this heel turn was on full display in the main event, and it was what you said. So there's a lot going on. I have a good friend I went to Emory with, who's a professor in where is he? South Carolina, North Carolina, something like that. Dan Mathewson is his name, who's actually taught courses on professional wrestling as part of sort of social critique, social drama, so all these things. And there, believe it or not, for any who may be interested, there is actually an academic field of study devoted to professional wrestling. So
I was not aware of that,
there, it,
and
it is true. But then again, there's an academic field of to almost anything. So
look, and hey, listeners, by the time this episode comes out, you'll have already heard the interview with Adrian Tchaikovsky. Yeah, talking about fantasy literature and sci-fi. I
oh,
now, yeah, look, I can deviate from the biblical text conversation whenever I want, as my wife likes to tell me whenever I'm like, "What do you think if I did this?" She's like, "It's your podcast," but I'll say
do it,
that I
do
may
it.
find somebody to talk about academic stuff. My mom, I would be remiss, and my mother would be disappointed in me if I did not bring up her father, my maternal grandfather, was friends with the Von Erichs. And I will say, I haven't really kept up with wrestling in a long time, but I
Okay.
remember one of the last really big things that I saw. It was in the John Bradshaw Layfield,
Yeah.
Eddie Guerrero, may he rest
Yeah.
in peace,
Oh my gosh.
arc.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
JBL brings a car out on the ramp,
Mm-hmm.
and he gets a guy from the crowd to come wash it.
Hmm.
That guy who came out of the crowd, his name is Eddie Villa, and we wrestled in high school
What?
together.
No
He
way.
was he was a local wrestler here on, I don't know what the circuit was, but something out of the the East Texas or Houston area. His name was Fast Eddie, and he is now an immigration attorney and still a friend of mine. But I remember watching that
Oh,
on SmackDown
yeah.
and like, what, Eddie? What? Yeah,
That is
and
amazing.
anyway, so
Wow.
I'm not
Wow.
a super huge fan now. Haven't
Yeah,
kept up with it. I do know John Cena. I think John Cena's a really funny guy.
he is.
Okay, Brad Kelly, I'm not going to take up any more of your time, but I
Just
am
so
going
you
to.
know, I just want to say this last, Jared. I have a WWE Championship belt in my office at Point Loma. So I didn't earn it. I just bought it. But I just want to just confess that
That's good enough for
it is
me.
it is real. This is
Eddie actually, when he went to an event, and I think it got what I called Harveyed. I think it got lost in Hurricane Harvey. But I
um,
had a an elbow pad that he bought for me, the Rock
nice.
elbow pad, and we would wear those when we wrestled
Love it.
competitively in high school. Brad Kelly, you have a standing invitation to talk about professional wrestling
Do
or prophetic texts or
it.
trauma or whatever you want. So this was such a pleasure. Thank you so much, man.
Hey man, thank you so much. Privileged to be on here. Great podcast, great people, and you're doing a great job. So I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Take care. Thank you so much for listening. Next week on the podcast is Marianne Bieland Kartzau. She will be discussing her chapter, Metaphors of Enslavement. It is the fourth installment in my series of interviews on the book Ancient Slavery in its New Testament Context. And much like Javal Coleman, who I believe was the last one, yeah, I think he's the most recent. It's a very broad topic to fit in a short chapter, but she did a good job of an introduction, and it was a fun conversation to have with her. So pick that book up. That book is available out there. Yeah. Same as I said up top, if you want to follow the podcast wherever you're listening, subscribe there, give whatever feedback version they have, likes, comments, things like that, to let me know what you think of the podcast, or hit us up, hit me up on, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, Spoutable, Twitter, Threads, WordPress, Tumblr, any of those places, or email me at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Or if you're feeling really generous, and I truly believe my audience is a generous bunch of people, you can support for $5 a month on Patreon. And, a little bit goes a long way. I'm not looking to get big numbers even to be able to consider this what my day job is. So, or even just getting to the point where I can start to pay people to do a better job of all the things I don't know how to do. I know how to read, and I know how to talk to people, and the editing and technical stuff has been a bit of an uphill climb. I've gotten better, but being able to pay someone to compose music, to design a logo, or to edit episodes, or manage the social media presence of the podcast. So $5 a month will move toward being able to achieve that goal of improving the podcast in ways that I won't be capable anytime soon. Yeah. So here's a quick preview of my conversation with Marianne Bielan Kartzau. If you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Thanks.
Then in the Gospel of Luke, Mary is, first of all, it's Luke writing, not Mary. That's also one difference between Paul and Mary. Luke describes Mary in a context where she is somehow doing something specific, something typical of women in the ancient world. She is asked to deliver a son. She's asked to be pregnant. She's asked to do something on behalf of God in a way. And she is doing what female slaves in the ancient world were, what shall I say, not famous for, but that was the main value, value of female slaves. It was that they could, of course, increase the stock of slaves. They could be pregnant and produce more slaves. So female slaves in a certain age were very attractive, and they also had a high economical value because of this capacity of childbirth. And we even read in some documents that it's calculated. Okay, this woman, she's 20 something. She has a healthy body. She has no mistakes. She probably will survive 4 birth or 3 birth of children. So then she's valued higher than, for example, a man on the same age, or as an older woman who will not have survived so many births. So that is a typical task, I could say, for a female slave. That is to be pregnant on behalf of the owner. It could be, of course, with the owner himself, or it could be with someone else. That wasn't so important. The important thing was that that baby was a new slave. That baby produced by a slave mother became one more slave and one more slave and one more slave, if she survived. Otherwise, I mean, it was just one gain and one, you got one and you lost one. So that is a discourse or a discussion in the ancient world that I think can illuminate what's going on in that passage when Mary says, I will do as you want to. And then somehow I think she imitates or she echoes or she's doing some of the typical work of a female slave. And when then she's even naming herself slave, I think that's a little sign to us what kind of reality she is doing in that text, or she's saying, I'm willing to do, or not really willing, but she said, I will do what you say. I'm your slave. I will do what you say.